My name is Ali, I'm a doctor and YouTuber.
I'm Taymor, I'm a data scientist and writer.
And you're listening to Not Overthinking,
the weekly podcast where we think about happiness, creativity, and the human condition.
Hello and welcome back to Not Overthinking. This is actually the first episode after we took a break for a week. Taymor, how are you doing? I haven't spoken to you in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, crazy. I'm doing well. I was in Scotland last weekend, which I think was partly why we didn't end up recording a podcast. It was a good week of work. How about you?
Good week of work. I've had a good week of work as well. It's another weekend. We're recording this on a Saturday and I've just spent all day trying to film an online class in how to edit videos, where I talk about my entire workflow for video editing from start to finish, with the intention of putting it on Skillshare that I'm playing around with. But I thought this week we would talk about what this podcast actually means to us and like what value we think other people are going to get out of it, because that's actually been a reasonable point of contention amongst the two of us.
Oh yeah, right from the start, I think.
Right from the start. So I'll just kind of summarize your position on this podcast.
Well, what you think my position is.
What I think your position is for the listeners, and then it would be nice to hear from people to see what they think. So your position is that you want this podcast to be like a sort of highbrow, intellectually stimulating, completely not giving any advice about anything at all, and literally just discussing deep issues that you think the world should think more deeply about. Things like, what it means to be friends with someone, or, social optionality, or this sort of stuff. And you don't really like it when we discuss topics like motivation and productivity, because you view those as being too life advicey, too self-helpy. And you also don't really like it when people say that our podcast is easy to listen to, because your like ideal view of this podcast is that every single episode challenges the listener intellectually in terms of and kind of makes them think about the world a different way. Is that a fair summary of your position?
No, it's not. All right. So I don't like your use of the term highbrow to begin with. I think that's a mischaracterization of the vibe that I try and get across. I also don't like your use of words like intellectual, because that is also a mischaracterization of the vibe. And I think the vibe is really the vibe. Okay, Venkatesh Rao, my favorite blogger, he has a term called domestic cozy, and I think the idea of a cozy vibe is really what I'm going for. And I think I agree with you in that I think ideally the episodes would be hard hitting isn't quite the right word, but the episodes would sort of make people think and introspect, and sort of actively engage with the topic. But I don't think words like highbrow and intellectual are what I'd like to go for, because I don't think I think you can sort of actively think and engage with something without it having to be highbrow or intellectual. And I think these kinds of things should basically be the realm of like anyone to think about and discuss, rather than the intellectual elite or whatever other associations there are with words like intellectual and highbrow. So I don't want to go for that, but I do. Yeah, I mean we've had some reviews, very nice reviews on the whole, that say, oh, it's really easy to listen to. And one of our sort of cousins in a group chat said that a couple of days ago as well. And I think that's kind of what sparked this topic, because I was like, oh no, why is it easy to listen to? Because I feel like the most sort of interesting and engaging and sort of lasting impact kind of content, it requires some thought. It requires some like active engagement, don't you think?
Requires some thought, requires some active engagement. So are you trying to, so is your ideal, as in, so you want this podcast to have an impact on listeners in some way?
Yes, I think we both want that.
Okay. So you don't really liken it to, for example, BBC Radio 2's Breakfast Hour with Nick Griffin, and I don't know who any of these presenters are. Yeah. Probably not Nick Griffin, he's like a BNP sort of guy. Anyway.
I thought he was on Family Guy.
Was he on Family Guy? Maybe that's what I'm referring to. Who am I thinking of as the BNP guy?
No, I think you're right. I was making a joke. I think there's something Griffin on Family Guy.
Is it? Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't really catch that joke. But anyway, so you don't want it to be like BBC Radio 2 Breakfast Hour. You want it to be like, something that people leave every single week and think, damn, that's had an impact on me.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I think that's the bar. I think that's the goal. I mean, I almost certainly we don't hit it. I like to think there are a few episodes where certainly I gained a lot from like the discussion and I was sort of engaging with it, and I hope that listeners did as well. But I also think there's been a few episodes where it's been less like that, and more kind of easy to listen to. Just listening to a couple of guys chatting, and people do like that, and it's really nice, and super grateful. It really is a honor that people are actually listening to us have a chat every week. But I feel like we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard than just let's have a pleasant chat because people seem to like that. And I think that the higher standard should be that yes, pleasant chat that's enjoyable to listen to, but ideally it would also, make listeners think and actively reflect and have some lasting impact on them. That it just seems so obvious that should be the goal.
Okay, so I think that's a very reasonable goal to have. My issue with that particular goal is that, as we've discussed in some of the previous episodes, it creates far too much of a high bar for this podcast. Because, for example, one thing that we both appreciate and that our viewers, our listeners rather, appreciate is the consistency with which we upload a podcast episode. But I feel like a problem that we've had in the past is that we've set this bar so high that, it's got to be intellectually stimulating. Sorry, without using the word intellectual. It's got to be
stimulating.
Cognitively stimulating. It's got to be stimulating in some way or another. Specifically cognitively stimulating as opposed to stimulating in other ways. It's got to be stimulating, and therefore we would shy away from just having a chat about topics that we find interesting. So maybe the way to think about this is that, ideally we'd occasionally have topics, or sometimes have topics that make people really think and that actually have a quote high impact on some people. But overall, I mean, it's a podcast. Even like my favorite podcast in the world, like the Tim Ferriss Show, even there are only a handful of episodes of that I would say have actually had an impact on my life. The rest of them have been just interesting, easy listening to Tim Ferriss interview some famous person talking about stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're disagreeing here. I think like we agree that the goal sort of, it would be nice if all of our podcasts are sort of really engaging and have a lasting impact. It is a high bar to reach, and there's no way we're going to reach it every week. But like, what's the disagreement then? What do you think we're disagreeing on? Like, what's your position? You sort of stated my position at the beginning. What is actually your position?
Okay, so the way I thought your position was that it is better to not have a podcast recording in a given week if we don't have a topic that you feel is going to be cognitively stimulating enough.
I don't think that's my position.
Because for example, in the past we've done several weeks where we've done these in between episodes where our schedules haven't been able to overlap that particular week, and so we've just I've uploaded the audio from a YouTube video, or we've uploaded the audio from another podcast that you or I have been on, or both of us in the case of that bird episode party podcast. And I feel like you have felt bad about the fact that we've had to do in between episodes, and we've had a couple, and you sort of have this selection bias. It's a selection bias. It's a confirmation bias where we get maybe 2 or 3 emails out of 100 people saying that, I actually kind of prefer it when you talk about intellectually stimulating topics. And then you think, yes, see, everyone prefers the cognitively stimulating stuff. Everyone hates Ali sharing life advice about motivation and productivity. See, checkmate atheist.
I don't think it's really confirmation bias, because I completely recognize that plenty of people, I'm sure a bunch of people like the in-between episodes. We definitely did have a few emails saying, oh man, I was kind of gutted when I saw it was an in-between episode or whatever. I'm sure some people do like it. And I'm sure plenty of people also like the kind of life advice-y stuff that you like to do. However, I think there is a real question about, I think there's 2 questions we should talk about. The first is about, since last week, you sort of announced on your email newsletter that we are going to be doing the podcast every 2 weeks from now on. And so I think we should discuss why we've made that decision rather.
On that note, I think we should go back to once a week rather than every 2 weeks.
What? Okay. So let's talk about that in a sec. And then I think the other thing that's really important to discuss is the extent to which we should just be making content that people like versus making content that we think is meaningful and important and that we want people to like, and hopefully they'll also like. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to use terms like pandering to the audience, because I think that's kind of harsh on the audience. And I think it's great that people actually listen to whatever we have to say. But I guess sort of having our own sort of direction and our own kind of vision for what we want this to be, versus creating content that will appeal to the most number of people, for example. So let's talk first about the 2 weeks versus 1 week. So last week, I was actually at home and I was like, Ali, let's record a podcast. And you were like, oh no, let's do it. We'll do it. No, let's start doing it once every 2 weeks or something. And I was like, okay, yeah, all right, fine. Why did you do that? Yeah.
I think it's because last week was a particularly quote busy weekend and week for me. Even though I absolutely hate the word busy. I flew to Belfast for this YouTube conference. I was up all night editing various videos from that. And then I came home, and then we had people over, went to a brunch party, and then I had to drive back to Cambridge that evening. And so all of this stuff just kind of piled up in my head, and I was thinking, you know what? It's been 24 episodes. That's literally 6 months of doing this every single week without taking a break. And we could have just released an in-between episode, but because we've got 2 or 3 in the bank from various other things that we've done. But at the time, I was just thinking, you know what? It's the 6-month mark. Might as well have a break for a week and see how I feel about this whole thing. And so I kind of just floated the suggestion, why don't we do it every other week? Because, for example, Episode Party, the podcast, does it every other week. And that would seem to be a more sustainable way of doing things. But then over this last week, I've actually been thinking, and provided that, once we get a remote recording setup like what we're doing right now, we're not in the same place.
Yeah.
It's actually very, very, very doable to just do this stuff once a week, even when you're going to be off traveling around the world or doing whatever.
I don't know what you just said. I think you were just saying it's actually very doable and very good, but you sort of froze just as you said that, and like you have been freezing from time to time, by the way, during this conversation.
Oh, okay. Well, clearly this remote setup isn't necessarily working. It would be interesting to see because we're both recording audio locally, and so I wonder if, because there are times where this sort of FaceTime feed sort of plays up, but then you speed up, and I think it retains the timing. So hopefully,
it does.
The fact that we're recording locally should work. But yeah, that's what I said. I actually said that once we get this remote thing going, it's very doable to just do every single week.
Yeah.
And I think I should be less annoyed when we do in between episodes, because I think the in between episodes are pretty good, personally, even though you might not.
Because you're posting like your YouTube videos as podcasts.
Exactly, they're pretty good. And like, there's this other one where I was interviewed on some other dude's podcast, and I think I, delivered some fire advice, and I was like, damn, this would make for a good podcast episode. So that'll be coming up as an in between episode at some point when we failed to record one for a particular week. But yeah, no. So I think I'm not sure whether I just like announced to the email newsletters it was happening once every other week. I thought my angle was more like, we're not really sure. We might do it every other week.
Oh, okay. I did read the newsletter. I think you told me that you said it on the newsletter, or there was I can't remember.
You don't read my email newsletters, mate. I read all your email newsletters, all 3 that you've released so far in your life. Yeah, we'll be back next week with a new episode, fingers crossed, and might drop down to an every 2 weeks release schedule, but everything's fluid at the moment. There we go, twat.
Okay, yeah, fair. I'm sorry for mischaracterizing what you said in your email newsletter.
Anyway, let's. There's a review that I want to read, because we read reviews each week. This is the most recent one by Prof786 that was left like 3 days ago. I was tempted to give less stars as they failed to be consistent last week. I think he means fewer stars.
Nice, got him.
But I gave 5 stars regardless, because under the warm, relaxing tone of each episode's conversation, there are genuine insights, usually constructed right before your eyes. So the podcast becomes valuable on at least 3 levels for me, anyway. Number 1, it's a comfortable listen, like watching Modern Family or Friends.
Okay, I'll
Number 2,
I'll address that later.
Number 2, there are valuable insights, and number 3, you get to see how 2 high-functioning individuals (brackets my pretentious way of saying awesome people) think. I love this podcast, so please, Ali and Taimur, consistently upload, ! But also thank you. You guys do an incredibly valuable thing for what I imagine to be many, many people. That's nice.
That's so nice. That's really, really nice. I think Modern Family, it shouldn't be a comfortable listen. There's a lot of depth there. Like you should really rewatch every episode like 3 times to understand all the jokes. But yeah, I think that's a nice review, and it's like a nice shove in the direction of doing it weekly. The only point at which I feel kind of bad about the in-between episodes and stuff is if, for example, one of my friends in real life, I don't know, however it comes up, but like they find out that we have a podcast or something, and they're asking, okay, like what episodes should I listen to? And then I scroll through sort of the list on our website of like the 24 episodes, and I think there's the first bunch of them have like a high density of ones that I'm really proud of, but then kind of in between, in sort of the middle, there's just like a bunch where I'm like, what were we talking about that week? Like what is this? And then a bunch where it is actually in between episodes. And so, yeah, I feel kind of bad then, because it's like you're sort of looking back on this body of work, and it kind of feels like a lot of it is, I don't know, not that good. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, yes, I know exactly what you mean. So it's exactly the same with YouTube videos, in that there are a few, and in that for most YouTube channels there are a handful of hits, and then everything else is filler content.
Yeah, but I don't look. I fully back the whole like quantity over quality thing when you're starting out, or this kind of thing. But I don't know, man. I just kind of felt bad scrolling through the list, and seeing that there was a couple of months of worth of podcasts where I didn't think it was good enough for me to sort of recommend that my friend listen to them.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's kind of the same thing with my YouTube videos. Like that's why everyone says that, and like anyone's blog and anything like that. That's why people say you should have a start here page, a page where you've curated the best, the most popular, the most interesting episodes, because it's pretty much a given that not everything you produce is going to be a hit that you will wholeheartedly recommend. For example, if people are seeing my YouTube channel for the first time, I will usually point them in the direction of the most popular videos, i.e. how I take notes on my iPad and how I ranked first at Cambridge University with my essay memorization technique, because I put so much effort into those videos. I wanted those to be viral potential videos, and therefore I'm happy to recommend them as a starting point, because that is the entry drug, the gateway drug through which most people subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if it's a random, vlog of me building my desk setup, I fully recognize that that is going to be filler content for a lot of people, but that's fine, because when people follow a YouTube channel, you've got some videos that are designed to bring new audience in, and that's their sort of key performance indicator. And then you've got other videos that are designed to, please the audience that you already have. And I think a big part of being a YouTuber, or being a content creator of any sort, is getting the right balance between making the sort of content that pleases the community that you've already, by the grace of God, managed to develop, versus thinking that every single piece needs to be so good that you can recommend it to an entirely new person.
Yes, yeah, I think that is the core of sort of my sort of dilemma with this, because I feel like, I think it's amazing that there are some people out there who will happily listen to whatever we have to say every week. I think that's amazing and that's great. But it feels kind of bad to sort of rest on our laurels and produce something that, just produce something that people who are already sort of fans of the podcast will enjoy, just because they, are already fans of the podcast. I don't know. It just doesn't sit that right with me. It feels like an injustice somehow.
Okay, so I mean, the main thing, and for me, the primary, like a number one priority in this podcast was just making it sustainable and not having too high a bar. For example, if I, for my YouTube videos, if I were to every single week try and make a video like, for example, Matt Diavella, who makes practically like a 10-minute documentary every single week, that just wouldn't be sustainable, especially because of the fact that I've got a full-time job. And so having that bar means I just wouldn't produce any YouTube videos. So what do you propose would be the solution? Because it's not the case that, if we both worked a little bit harder each week, then each week we'd be able to create this valuable episode, because there is actually a finite amount of content that you and I are, versed in enough to be able to discuss in an interesting way. And a big chunk of those came up at the start, because obviously we were just going through the topics that we had already thought about. But then when it comes to the point where like, what should we discuss this week? What would you suggest as like a solution to this conundrum of creating value every week?
I think true in-between episodes are an injustice, but I don't think sort of slightly worse than usual normal podcast episodes are an injustice. I think the in-between episodes, it's not really, it's kind of lying about the consistency thing. It's not, on weeks, we've had maybe a handful of in-between episodes. During those weeks, we were inconsistent. We didn't record a podcast. We didn't do the work that week. So it is, I think in-between episodes fundamentally break the consistency thing. All right. So I think, I feel like we definitely shouldn't do in-between episodes, because like, how hard is it to sit down for like half an hour to 40 minutes every week? We can do it remotely or whatever. And so I think we were complacent at various points where it was like, oh, we do have this like backlog of other random content that we could just shove on there. And I think it was complacency that led to those. And I think that's probably what I have most of a problem with. And I don't think we should do those. But I think it's absolutely fine if, there are weeks where we sit down and, there's no like groundbreaking new theory that one of us is proposing or whatever. And we're just talking about something and hopefully it leads somewhere interesting. Maybe it doesn't. But again, the whole point, at least for me and what I want to do with this, is not necessarily that we reach some kind of valuable conclusion every week, but just that we have an interesting discussion that will sort of let listeners think through their own stuff. So I actually don't think the bar for interesting topics is that high, because we're not going for like we have to explore this topic to its conclusion. We're going to have a chat in our own kind of way and in our own sort of ways of thinking about this thing. And so we can actually pretty much do that every week. And so I think the only issue is when we are truly complacent and don't record a podcast in a given week. What do you think?
Okay, I actually think that was spot on. Because you're right. The in-between episode thing just is a result of inconsistency, and then kind of trying to dress it up as, hey, we've been consistent every week for the last 6 months, which sounds kind of cool, but actually isn't true at all, because in-between episodes are kind of cheating. I think, I don't know, there have been some weeks where it hasn't been a matter of complacency, it's been a matter of logistics. And, if I'm working in the hospital on the weekend and stuff, it does take some level of forward planning in order to get a proper podcast episode each week. And almost every podcaster that I know will have some sort of backlog. It's not the case that, the Saturday before, like the day before they're releasing their podcast, they would be just recording it.
Yeah. No, I think a backlog is absolutely fine. And we should get to the point where we do have a backlog, so that during the weeks where it is truly, truly difficult to align the schedules, we can sort of use those. And I think that still counts as consistency, because we have done the work at that point. But for example, last week, I went to Scotland. I took the podcasting gear and we kind of roughly planned that, we can do it while I'm in Scotland and while you're in Cambridge or whatever. And we were just both a bit bit complacent about it. I never really reached out to you saying, hey, we're doing the podcast. And you never really reached out to me saying the same thing. Maybe we're both just sort of expecting the other one to sort of carry the weight and be like, Tame, sit down, do the podcast. Or like, Ollie, we're doing a podcast now. But we didn't do it. And that was just pure complacency, I think.
Okay, yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. And actually, while I was in Belfast for this conference thing, I did have several hours where I was sitting in my hotel room video editing. That half an hour could have easily been taken out to do a podcast episode.
Yeah, half an hour a week is, before we recorded this, I wasted half an hour in the toilet on my phone. And I do that multiple times a day. Half an hour in 1 week is so easy. It's nothing.
Okay, yeah, fine. I see where we're going with this. Okay, so the idea is that from now on, we're doing it every week, but we're not having kind of fake in between episodes unless we absolutely have to. Although I do have this podcast recording where I did this other, which I actually think is really good. But we can do that some other time. So our plan is to, at some point, batch record like 2 in a row so that we're at least 1 ahead. And then we at least always have something in the bank. And then the idea is that even if we're doing it remotely, now that I think FaceTime plus local recording of audio is a very good setup, especially now that we know that this timing thing is going to work out. So hopefully there's only a 0.5 second delay that I can fix in post, and then this will hopefully sound like a natural conversation. That was kind of my main issue with remote recording. I just always kind of felt that, it's just not as nice. It's not as high quality as like doing it in person. That sometimes, you just can't do it in person.
Yeah, I think it's definitely not as high quality. And there is this half a second delay. You are breaking up from time to time. And so I think you can't, we can't really have the quick-witted banter that the audience has become used to over the past few months, just because of the time thing. But yeah, I think it's fine, basically. But I think, I'm glad we agree on the no in between episodes, and every week, or rather every week, we will publish a 30 to 50 minute sit down discussion that we have about something. I think the issue, we've had issues in the past where we are truly like, oh man, like what do we talk about? And I think that really just comes from, I don't know how you feel about this. I think I just need to sort of make more notes more consistently about everything. And like when I do have random ideas and I do note them down, they often end up becoming podcast topics. But for the past couple of weeks, to be honest, my head has just sort of been buried in the startup stuff. And I haven't really been doing much thinking outside of the startup. And I think that's bad. And so I think this will sort of force us both to engage with,
the wider world.
Engage
the human condition.
Literally engage with the human condition, sort of consume interesting content that'll spark off ideas and sort of make sure we're sort of writing these things down and actually thinking about stuff so that when it comes to recording the podcast, it's not like, oh, what did I do this week? I literally just did my startup and hung out with my mates a couple of times. It's like, I actually had some thoughts about some things and developed my own thinking regarding something, and that's sort of valuable.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I think one thing that actually that would help with that is to not have this requirement in our heads that it be a 30 to 50 minute conversation. I think having the bar that, as long as we talk about this thing for 15 minutes, that would be very reasonable, because often I have ideas for things, like Tiago wrote that article recently about servant hedonism. I recently read some books that would make for interesting discussion topics, but I wouldn't have thought to bring them up as podcast topics because I think, there's not enough
meat
mileage in here. There's not enough meat to last 30 to 50 minutes. So I think having the bar set at a 15-minute episode is absolutely fine. And if there's more to discuss, then there's more to discuss. And then, if there really is absolutely nothing else, then it could be like, lovely day today type situation.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. And I think I think just the remit of what we've said this podcast is about is actually extremely broad, and people seem to be fine with that. And so worst comes to worst, we could just have a weekly therapy session. Like Casey Neistat has a podcast where it's like,
couples therapy.
Yeah, couples therapy, where it's literally he and his wife just discussing the sort of problems and conflicts they had with one another that week. And it's so good. It's incredible. And so, worst case scenario, we just do a little...
a little therapy session where you can be, Ollie, why do you not use emotional labor or whatever that phrase is?
Oh my God, mate, on the Scotland trip, we were, while I was, I had to do all the driving and sort of on long road trips in Scotland, Lewis, who's one of my friends, was basically reading the good bits from the emotional labor thread PDF on his phone, and we were discussing it. It was awesome. We should definitely talk about that on a podcast.
Perfect. Emotional labor. That would make for a fantastic episode.
We'll link to this emotional labor thing in the show notes. It's very, very good.
Tamer will do that because you're going to do the show notes for this week.
Right.
So actually, a few months ago, I randomly mentioned this idea of emotional labor to Molly, my housemate, and she was just really taken aback with it because she was like, "Oh my God, there's a word for it."
Yeah, exactly.
Because she was saying something like, "Look, Ali, when I'm in the house, I'm the one who always has to remind you to take out the trash, to sort out the recycling, just to make sure that the kitchen counters are clean. And I feel like all you do is come home and then do your video editing. I was like, yeah, it's all the emotional labor. And she was like, oh my God, yeah, that's a word for it. It really is emotional labor. So
yeah, that's spot on. And I think you're really bad at it, and I think we should talk about that probably next week.
wow, I see how it is. I'm actually busy next week. No, I'll make the time. Make the time to talk about emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, emotional labor.
Okay, and then the other, so I think we've put the 1 week versus 2 week issue to bed. We're going to record a podcast every week and publish a non-in-between episode every single week. The other thing was like, to what extent should we, excuse me for the term, pander to the audience versus stick to our own vision?
So
I feel like you have a strong bias towards pandering. I'm just going to say that now.
I actually don't think I do. I think I have a 50-50 bias towards pandering versus sticking to my own vision. Because, for example, if I was just pandering to the audience, I would never release YouTube videos about how I make videos. Because, that is such a small, I mean, they get like 20,000 views compared to like the 400,000 views that a study with me video would get. So if I actually cared about pandering to the audience, I'd be studying for my exams every single weekend. So I can make a study with me video out of it.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was wrong. You don't pander.
But I do have a strong bias towards but like we've had emails in from people who've actively taken the time out to say, hey, I'd love it if Taimur could talk more about his startup and how he got started with it. And you would think, oh, that's not interesting. Oh, it's boring. I don't want to talk about my startup. But actually, it's an interesting topic for a lot of people. I think once we have the great thing about having a reasonably sized audience is that the ideas for content are never ending because people send their requests in for stuff. Like I'm never going to run out of YouTube videos to make because all I have to do is post an Instagram story saying, hey guys, what do you want to see next? And 300 people are going to reply with video suggestions, and then I'm sorted for the next 10 years of my life.
Wait, so you're saying, what are you saying with regards to pandering versus vision then? So you're saying...
What I'm saying is that on weeks where we have an interesting topic that we want to talk about, how do we be friends? How do we make friends? Even though no one has specifically asked about it, then we should do that topic. But on weeks where it's a bit of a slow week where we're like, oh, not really sure, it's worth keeping a note on a shared Notion document or something of all of the various requests that we've had in and literally just start from the top and go for it.
I think that could be interesting. Yeah, fine. I think that's fine.
What was your stance on pandering to the audience? Because it sounded like you were quite anti-pandering.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general I am anti-pandering because I think I think there's lots of different types of content that people can produce, and I think I probably have a strong bias towards trying to produce content that is novel, and I think I probably go too far in that direction, and so it doesn't make me happy when we're essentially doing information arbitrage, which is the two of us have our own sort of interests and we sort of read stuff around tech and you do productivity and stuff like that, and we could produce a lot of content where we just read other people's things, repackage them a bit, and sort of produce this content to a different audience who isn't exposed to these ideas already. This sort of information arbitrage kind of thing, and I think the audience will be happy with that because they're getting information that they didn't know about previously, but
and they're getting value.
Yeah, they're getting value, but I think that's not something that is uniquely personal to us. And I think there is surely, there's plenty of people doing information arbitrage out there. For example, I mean, you kind of do, maybe you'll disagree with this, you kind of do this where, for example, the sort of bleeding edge of productivity sort of gurus and stuff is people like Tiago Forte, and things like GTD. I don't know if you count that as bleeding edge, but in your videos, for example, you talk about productivity and that kind of thing quite a lot, but I don't know if you use terms like GTD, and I'm sure you kind of consume the content from a bunch of other sort of productivity people and sort of repackage it to some extent with your own sort of twist and provide that to an audience who doesn't read about productivity stuff as much as you do. And I think that's valuable, but I think that kind of thing is just less unique and personal to us. I think plenty of people are out there doing that kind of thing, and so it'll be nicer if more of our content is novel, personal stuff that isn't sort of just information arbitrage.
Okay, so there's a few things that come to mind here. Firstly is a quote I came across a couple of weeks ago, and that is that there is no such thing as a unique message. There are only unique messengers.
Yes.
Which I think definitely applies in this circumstance. I don't think anything we talk about is ever truly novel. We thought, it was this amazing thing, the social optionality stuff. Turns out there's been books written on the idea of social optionality and group dynamics and what makes for interesting conversation and what makes for interesting, group hangouts. Clearly, what we're doing is information arbitrage in one form or another. now, though, because there is no truly novel content. That's point number one. Point number two is that I used to think that up until recently that actually information arbitrage wasn't valuable. I had a conversation with a new friend called Thomas Frank, who runs probably the biggest productivity channel on YouTube. He's got like 1.5 million subscribers, 1.5 million. We had a Zoom call the other day, and he's got this like online productivity course that he made on Skillshare, and it was very surface level. It was like, how to use a calendar, how to use a to-do list, how to quick capture stuff. I mean, like really, really, really basic level 1 productivity stuff. And yet it's had such a fantastic reception. People say that course has changed their lives seeing those videos. And I asked Thomas about this. I said, hey man, look, obviously you know all about GTD and all about all these funky productivity tools, and you're a massive productivity nerd. Why did you make a course for people that was so surface level? And he said that because, to be honest, there are hundreds of thousands of students around the world that don't even know how to manage a calendar. And if you are the sort of person that knows what GTD stands for, you are already doing pretty all right. You don't really need me to tell you about productivity. So in a way, all he's doing is information arbitrage, but he is providing an immense value to his audience in that sense, because in a way, Tim Ferriss is just doing information arbitrage. Any interview podcast, even Joe Rogan, which is like the biggest podcast in the world, is just information arbitrage, asking Elon Musk about his own ideas that have probably been written about in books or in Tim Urban's blog posts. Tim Ferriss' interview is all just standard surface level stuff, interviewing book writers about the stuff they're writing in their books. There's no such thing as not information arbitrage. So I'm not really sure what you mean about this idea of us creating novel content that's unique to us. I think everything that we create is just something that's already out there, but we're applying our own unique twist to it. And I think that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that any of the stuff we've talked about or sort of come up with is like, I don't mean to suggest we are pushing humanity forwards with these ideas, right? I truly believe there is no unique idea under the sun.
So what's your main beef with our podcast episodes, which are, as you rightly said, information arbitrage? Like one idea for a podcast theme that I want to do is on weeks where we have literally nothing to talk about, I just pick a random book off my bookshelf, like, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, read the summary and we just talk about that. That is pure information arbitrage, but it's applying it to our own lives, it's applying a unique twist to it. I think that would make for, decent podcast episodes.
Yeah. Okay, here it is. I don't have a problem with information arbitrage. I agree to a large extent. That is that's probably most of any content that's out there. However, I think there is very little I think there is comparatively less content out there on the kinds of topics that you and I get really excited about, like social interaction, that kind of thing. There is truly not that much content out there about that stuff. And we have like a particular interest and a particular way of thinking about and approaching those kinds of topics. And so I just think it's like more valuable. Okay, I think it's more valuable to be arbitraging rarer information that we are like, it's like, okay, it's like you can sort of, this whole idea of arbitrage, right? It comes from sort of finance where it basically means, you sort of buy something from one place and sell it at another place for like a different price. So yeah. Maybe someone on one side of your village produces some pottery, and he isn't in contact with people on the other side of the village, and so what you can do is you can buy his pottery for like a tenner on that side of the village, and then you can run to the other side and sell it to people there for like 15 quid, and you're basically doing this sort of arbitrage where you're connecting the sort of the buyer and the seller, and that's kind of what's going on with the information here, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna read these sort of niche productivity books or whatever in one place, and then go and sort of impart that information to people at a different place who don't read those books. And so yeah, I think here we go. Here's like, I think there's already a fairly efficient market for lots of topics of information. I think there's a fairly efficient market for productivity stuff. A ton of people are talking about this stuff. And so, if people aren't getting their sort of good value productivity information from us, there are other sources they can get it from. However, I think there are topics where the market is much less efficient around like social interaction and that kind of thing, which we're really interested in. I think we think a lot about it. I've started reading about it. I should probably do more. And so surely it's more valuable to make those markets more efficient than try and like create these markets that are already like existent.
Yeah, fair enough. I take your point. Although on that note, we both know people who have said that our consistency episode has changed their life. And I don't know a single person who said that an episode that we did about, social optionality has changed their life. About a social interaction kind of thing has changed their life. So even though I agree that the market is much more efficient in the realm of productivity than it is in the realm of social skills, it's still valuable to our audience and to just people if we share our, semi-unique in experiences of consistency, of motivation, of productivity stuff. So I don't think we should, pew-pew the productivity stuff just because, I don't know if I use pew-pew in the right context there, but if we should
I've never heard it.
I think poo-poo is what I mean. We should poo-poo the productivity stuff just because the market is more efficient in that regard. But yeah, I agree. It's nice to do social skillsy kind of stuff. And I think every week when we sit down, if we were like, oh, what should we talk about? If there was a social skills related topic, I'd love to talk about it. But there have been at least half the weeks where we've been like, oh, actually, I don't know. Let's talk about consistency. Let's talk about motivation.
Yeah, look, I'm not trying to make any kind of extreme statement here of like, we're never talking about productivity ever again, Ali. I'm just saying that, I think we should have a slight bias towards, the topics that the topics that are more unusual when it comes to the kind of content that's out there, and the topics that we are sort of more uniquely positioned to muse about. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that seems very reasonable. I'm on board with that. I'll start making a note of all my... I actually found I was sort of doing a clear out of some of my productivity apps the other day while I was at work, because I was really bored at work on the ward round. And I found this note that I made like in 2014, which was from a Charisma on Command live webinar that I attended. And I was like, nice. Damn, this is like really good stuff. And it was so on point. I was like, I can't believe I wrote this down like in 2015 or 2014 and stuff. So yeah, it's all these social skills things that I will sort of flag up as potential conversational topics for the podcast.
Nice. I think that's a side note to end on. I think we've made some progress here. I think it's good that we've actually chatted formally about this arrangement, which we haven't really. I don't know. We've never really sat down and formally chatted about the podcast like this before, right?
I don't think we have. Yeah, it's been very sort of occasional informal chats.
Yeah. Cool. Insight of the week.
Oh God, insight of the week. Let me have a think.
I had a good one this week, and I thought, I think it was like yesterday, I thought, okay, this is a good insight of the week.
Let me look through my notes archive from stuff that I formally came across the concept of a flywheel this week.
Oh, okay. Why don't you explain that?
So I came across it in, I don't even know where I found it, but this was the phrase from the blog that I read this on. It said, a flywheel is a mechanical device designed to efficiently store rotational energy. Well, that's how an engineer would describe a flywheel. I majored in English. To me, a flywheel is a wheel that's really hard to get started. Once it gets going, however, it's really hard to stop. And I've heard this term flywheel so many times, get the flywheel going and stuff in the realm of like business and creativity and entrepreneurship and stuff. But I never quite understood what it meant. But now that I have this sort of bit in my vocabulary where it's just the simple word to describe this idea of something that takes absolutely ages to get going, like, for example, a YouTube channel or like a blog. But then once it gets going and once it gets some traction, then the momentum carries it forward. So I think having that, like I've actually found myself using that in quite a few conversations these last 2 weeks. Now that I know what the word means, and be like, oh, actually, what you're thinking of here is sort of like a flywheel. And I had a friend who came over a few days ago. He was thinking of setting up his own personal website. And he was like, yeah, but what's the return on this going to be? It's going to take so much time. And I was like, look, man, it's a flywheel. It takes weeks to get started, but once it gets going, you've got the momentum that's going to carry it forward. And I felt super, super smart. So that was my insight of the week.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I think that's really good. I'm a big fan of that. I think it's a good mental model in general. Just give me a sec here. I'm going to find mine.
Also, I want you to learn how to edit podcast and get the right software for it, because I don't want to have to be doing it every week.
How long does it take you?
It takes about, it doesn't take that long. It's like 20 minutes at most, because all it involves is putting the audio files into Auphonic, just making sure they line up right, which is a bit harder to do, and then cutting out silences on Logic. So download Logic and you'll find.
All right, I'll do that. What was it?
This is why you should be writing down everything you come across. Quick capture. You would benefit from Thomas Frank's productivity course.
Despite you calling it surface level.
It's surface level, but clearly you aren't quick capturing your notes efficiently enough. So you don't really need the bleeding edge of productivity. You need the basics.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, today here's my sort of insight of the week. Today I went to the local market with my mum and grandma, and we bought some fruit and we bought some fish. And there was just like a really nice sense of community. And there were a few people who were handing out like programs for the local sort of independent cinema. We have like an independent cinema here in St. Albans called the Odyssey. So it's not like a chain like the Odeon or whatever. And I think that was really nice, because like on the face of it, the Odyssey, it doesn't show all the films that like a big blockbuster cinema would show. It shows 2 films a day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. But it's just like a nice thing for the community to rally around, and like everyone knows it, and like the people were there giving out these programs, and I actually thought, oh cool, yeah, I wonder what the Odyssey are up to like this week. So yeah, it was just a nice sense of community. And I think if I was I spent a lot of time in sort of central London, but if I was living in London, I don't think I would have that. And I think like living in sort of a sort of small town / city is really nice in that sense. Yeah, love a bit of community vibes.
Nice. Yeah, I can get on board with that. I think the Odyssey cinemas are very nice. The crown jewel of the community. But it's like how in Cambridge, the John Lewis is the crown jewel of the community. So it's not quite the same thing.
Nice. Okay, I think we should wrap up there. I think this has been a good chat. Thanks a lot for listening and see you next week.
Bye.